Hey, good morning, everybody. It's Monday, and that means it's time for this week's episode of Chatting with Agnes and Cecilia. I'm Cecilia Sepp. I'm the principal and founder of Rogue Tulips, and Rogue Tulips sponsors this weekly series where we discuss issues affecting the association management community. I'm here today with our regular guest, Aaron Castelo, who's an expert in state and government affairs and grassroots advocacy, and he is here this year doing a series because it's an election year. Agnes Amos Coleman, my usual co-host, is not here today because she's on travel. So hi, Agnes. And as Agnes always says, hello to our global audience. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. So I'd like to throw this over to Aaron so he can introduce himself. Aaron?
Hi, Cecilia. Thanks. Yeah, I'm Aaron Castelo. I am an association executive. I've worked for a number of different associations, usually in government relations capacity, specifically focused on states. And Cecilia and I are going to talk today about how associations can be looking forward to elections and election years and some of the things you need to do to sort of be prepared for the changes that come with each election cycle.
That's a great summary, Aaron. And our official topic for today is elections and strategy development, because we should always be developing our strategy, especially in an important year like this. So, Aaron, let's just dive right in. What are the three big things associations should focus on when it comes to elections and strategy development?
Yeah, so I do think that there's a couple of things that are really important to do, not just in election years, but things you should probably be doing all the time. And we can talk about that a little bit more as we go on with this discussion. But the first is issue management. And that is really having a handle on what issues affect your industry, your profession, whatever your issues that affect your association membership. So that includes monitoring issue trends and being on top of what kinds of issues candidates are talking about, that legislatures are talking about, that Congress is talking about, and sort of just, being on top of what issue trends are out there. And then as a sort of second and very important piece of that issue management is, establishing what your organization's positions are on various issues and really having a process in place. Having defined policy statements saying, this is our position on a certain issue, this is why, having a system in place to review those, to have a timely review of those, to make sure they're updated on a regular cycle with member and board input. Sometimes issues are no longer relevant, so you can retire a policy statement, new issues emerge, you need to develop a position on an issue. So the issue piece of it has those two sort of key parts. And then I would say another big one is assessing your organization's relationships. So as you think about, you should be thinking about this all the time, but specifically in an election year, who's running? Who do we have relationships with? What members of a legislature or of Congress or of an agency could be rolling out of their job that we've had a long-term relationship? And really assessing what relationships your organization has, what relationships your leaders and members have, and how those will be impacted by any potential change that could take place after an election. And a real effective way to do that, there's some different tools and software out there, but the best way to do that is just to survey your members and ask them about these kind of relationships that they have with elected officials and really stay on top of that. And it's all part of this, evaluating how are we going to be affected by a change in leadership that could take place with an election, by really taking a close look at those relationships that our members have, and also looking for your blind spots. Where do we not have relationships, where there's likely to be a change in leadership, or where there are relationships we need to develop. And another piece of this relationship thing that is contract lobbyists. So if your organization does hire contract lobbyists, you need to think about, how could a change in leadership, for example, in the state capitol, affect the relationships that your contract lobbyist has. So all those, that relationship piece of it as you look at elections is really important.
That's great. And then, I'm sorry.
I have one more, but go ahead.
He's got another one. Okay, sorry to interrupt. What's the third one? Sorry.
Okay.
You got me distracted with contract.
Right. So these all kind of tie together. But thirdly, I wanted to talk about coalitions.
Okay.
So obviously, hopefully, if you've got a robust government affairs and advocacy program, hopefully you have some strong coalition partners that you're working with. And it's obviously, you can be more effective when you're working with other groups that have similar interests and you can pool your resources. And really this plays all into this election year piece of it as well. And the two things I already talked about, coalitions also, can help you assess your relationships and what coalition partners have stronger relationships. What coalition partners maybe need to develop relationships or can help you develop relationships. And it ties also back to that issue piece because a coalition of groups that are working together on common issues or things where there's a common interest are also going to be able to sort of pool their knowledge to stay on top of the issues and the issue trends.
Right. And I just want to say, like I said, you kind of distracted me with talking about contract lobbyists, and I'm going to kind of explain why. So as a lot of people know, I do a lot of CAE mentoring, and that is actually a question, that's a study question, is about managing your contract lobbyists. So that's a really interesting thing. But building on that contract lobbyist comment, I think that's a really excellent point. People don't think about the web of relationships that they have. And a lot of that could be contract lobbyists, if you have a staff lobbyist. What about the relationships you may have with an elected official and those other relationships coming out of that? And then, how is that going to affect your coalition work with those relationships? Because I think, obviously we're going to have our issues identified at an association. We're going to know what we're working on and why. Hopefully we know why. Hopefully it's not just because somebody says, hey, I'm the chair this year and I think we should do this. Hopefully it's part of that larger strategy. But so you've talked about three things, Aaron: issue identification, assessment of relationships, and coalition building. So do you have any tips for the best way to tie these three things together within the strategy development process?
Well, I mean, I think, while we're looking at this through the prism of an election year, as I touched on earlier, these are kind of things that should be continuously done in your advocacy program. So, really, if you're engaging your members effectively and having good communication with them, you can work with them to assess those relationships they have and also help them understand the importance of relationships that they may have with elected officials or potential elected officials. And a good grassroots program, of course, which we've touched on in an earlier discussion, is really to help members build those relationships or identify those relationships that they may already have. So I think, as you noted, all these things work together. They're all part of an effective advocacy program. And you're going to really be able to weather whatever changes you might see in an election year if you're already doing these things and sort of staying on top of them as regular sort of elements of your advocacy program.
Well, so then where would grassroots fit into one of these three areas? Would you say that would be relationship assessment or coalitions?
Well, I think primarily I would see that as a relationship piece. Grassroots, though, as it relates to coalitions, would be, again, that pooling of resources. So you may, if there's a shift in an issue or what's happening with an issue, you may find that one of your coalition partners, that their grassroots, their rank and file members, may carry a more effective message, and that so those partnerships and coalitions are really important. I think in general, I would see the grassroots piece more as, if I had to file it in one of these three buckets, as kind of that relationship building. You want your members to sort of get to know their elected officials and learn something about them and be contacting them. But it's certainly, your coalition partners hopefully are going to have their own grassroots. And that's something that, if you are all able to tap into that together, you can be stronger as a whole.
Well, and so the strategy development, building what you said about strategy development and these three areas within that should be going on constantly. Do you think that strategy changes in an election year? Is there anything unique about it during an election year? Or is that only effective about maybe if you have a PAC?
Well, certainly if you've got, a political action committee and you're able to do political giving during an election cycle, all these elements are playing into those decisions that are being made about political giving. I would assume issues are a big one, looking at, what candidate may support your issues or what candidate is likely to win and actually hold a seat that may be important to your issues. But I think that, Obviously, these things are all heightened during an election year. You need to maybe think a little bit through that prism of, okay, what could change? But if you're doing all of these pieces of the issue assessment, the engaging with coalitions and the relationship building, I think that it's going to be easier to navigate an election year. You're not going to have to start from scratch. You've got some of these things in place. And yes, you're going to have that additional sort of, okay, what's going to happen in November? How is that going to affect these sort of pieces of our program? But if you've got those things in place, I think you're going to be able to weather that a little bit easier if there is a change.
Well, so here's something you made me start to think about, which is every election year, everybody doesn't roll over. So, maybe you're a senator, so you're in a 6-year term, so maybe you're not up for election this year. Is there a way you can leverage your relationships with people who aren't up for re-election this year to further your agenda? Or do you have tips about that?
Yeah, I think that comes into that sort of, understanding the dynamics of who's going to be committee chairs in a legislature. Some of that ties into that relationship building of assessing those relationships. Like, okay, we know this particular state senator is likely to move up next year to be a committee chair because the current committee chair is retiring or faces a tough election battle and may lose. So I view it sort of as, really understanding and leveraging those relationships you have. And of course, that ties in, you have to have some knowledge of how those changes may take place. Like, I'm thinking of state legislatures specifically, like, if there's going to be some rollover in a state capital, some states have term limits for their legislatures. So I know in Florida, for example, that they often know who the leadership are several years out just because of their natural rotation of term limits. So building relationships well in advance are obviously important, and sort of having an understanding that these folks may move up through the years to hold an important committee chairmanship, and obviously again, my experience is largely working in the states, but a great number of state legislators go on and get elected to Congress. I think something like half the current members of Congress formerly served in their state legislature. So it's a lot easier to develop a relationship with someone when they're serving as your state legislator than once they get to DC and are sort of a little more insulated by staff and whatnot. So that relationship piece is really important.
So it's basically over the long term, it seems to me the linchpin of these three is the relationship building and relationship assessment over time, and making sure you're keeping up with everyone and following their career arc through the legislature. We have about 3 minutes left. So in summary, we need to identify issues, we need to assess our relationships and continue building them all the time, not just in an election year. We also need to track in those relationships legislators on the move up from the state to the federal level. So I think that's excellent advice. And then coalitions, we didn't really talk too much about the coalition aspect, because I agree with you. I think the relationship part is really the linchpin of this. So since we have about 2 minutes left at this point, what would your advice be about working with your coalitions to the best that you can all the time, not just in election years?
Yeah, this is one of those things that you hear a lot about. It's really sort of always identified as a very, as a best practice by associations to work with coalitions. And the reason is that, you can pool your resources, and especially if you're a smaller association or you don't have a lot of resources that you can dedicate to advocacy, identifying partners that have similar issues to you is a really strong way for groups to effectively work together and speak with one voice. I most recently worked with a coalition that was working on professional licensing issues. So a number of organizations that represented professions that hold, licensure designations from states were working together on those issues. And it was a really effective way for a diverse set of professions that might not normally work together to come together and focus on this one issue, so that when they went to state legislators, their testimony could be similar, their message could be the same, and they could really focus on what is the thing that's affecting professions related to licensure. So you can really focus in very specifically on an issue and provide a lot of expertise and hopefully have some significant ability to influence the ultimate outcome policy-wise on that issue, because you've got those coalition partners.
Well, and you've probably heard it before, folks, but there's strength in numbers. So I'm a big believer in coalitions. I used to run a coalition years ago, short-lived one called the Alliance to Keep Americans Working, which was basically a business coalition working on the striker replacement legislation that had been introduced years ago. And, we didn't win, quote unquote, but we got our message across. So that's a personal experience I had working with coalitions on an important issue to the members at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce at that time. So, and speaking of time, we're out of it for this week. As a great topic, I want to thank Aaron again for joining us as part of this regular series this year. Watch for him again in a couple weeks, because we will have him back to continue this discussion. And Aaron, if people want to get in touch with you directly because maybe they have a question for you about today's topic, or maybe they'd like to hire you to give them some help with an issue, how's the best way they can reach you?
Yeah, I would say probably LinkedIn is just the easiest. Look for my profile, Aaron Castelo, and you can contact me through LinkedIn. My contact information is up there, and always happy to discuss these association topics related to advocacy.
That's great. And thanks again, Aaron. And like I said, we'll be having him back. He's one of our favorite regular guests. And so you'll see him here in a few weeks, as I said. And on behalf of myself and Agnes Amos Coleman, thank you for joining us this week. We're hoping Agnes will be able to join us next week. But as I said, she's on travel right now. And since we didn't want to discuss COVID-19 as a topic today, but COVID-19 is affecting the way we're doing things. So we all are, even in the virtual world. So I want to thank Agnes for her support. I want to thank Aaron again for being here. Thank you for watching. And as Agnes and I like to say, take 15 minutes and talk to somebody, because you might learn something. And speaking of learning, if you'd like to learn more about Rogue Tulips and how we can help you cultivate success at your organization, check us out at roguetulips.com. We're big supporters of the 501c League, which is a virtual membership organization, which is very timely in today's world of 2020, dealing with COVID-19 right now. We are a virtual membership organization for everybody in the association community and the people who love them. You can check out the league at the 501cleague.net. And don't forget to check out the 2 courses that are being offered this month on ethics and chapter relations. So thanks again for joining us, and we will be back next week. Bye, everyone.